Good morning. Greetings and welcome to the Philosophy of Religion course. My name is Andrew Bridges, and I will be the instructor for the course. This is going to be the first lecture presentation, and it is on philosophical concepts of God and some helpful vocabulary. I made a PowerPoint for this presentation to help with clarity, and so I'm going to share the screen and present the PowerPoint. Okay, very good. So here we are. Now, the material in this PowerPoint and in this presentation basically is from chapter 3 of the Big Questions text by Solomon and Higgins. I am using the 8th edition. And all the quotes from this presentation will come from that text. And so it's God's philosophical concepts and questions. And so let's just sort of begin by explain the relevance of this chapter and this presentation. So we're looking at varieties of concepts of God. And the reason this is important for the study of the philosophy of religion is that we'll be reading many philosophical texts in which the word God is presented by the author. And so first and foremost, this will be an exercise in hermeneutics. Do we understand precisely what the author means when the author uses the word God? And so we'll be going over a variety of definitions that relate to the concept of God or the divine. And this will help us to establish greater clarity when reading the text concerning the concepts of God. Ideally, what we want to do is make sure that our ideas on the concept of God match the author's understanding of the concept of God when we read the author's work. And so it's an exercise in hermeneutics, generally in literacy, that our concepts match the concept that the author has in mind. So for example, if we think about Plato's Euthyphro, and Euthyphro says the word the gods, what exactly does he mean by the gods? And so when Socrates later on in, say, the Crito says God, what does Socrates mean by God? It's not precisely what Euthyphro means by the gods, right? And so when Socrates uses the word God, which he'll use the word Zeus, and Euthyphro uses the word Zeus, although they're referring to the same God, they have different ideas on exactly what this God is and the characteristics of the God. And so this chapter will provide a lot of vocabulary to help us describe in detail what these ideas of either the gods or God is. And so this is essentially the point here. The authors, Solomon and Higgins, sort of begin to engage the student with this activity by asking quite fascinating philosophical questions. Again, these questions are to help the student generate clarity on the existing concepts of God they already have. And then as we read different philosophical texts, we'll begin to match the concepts of God that we have and expand the variety of concepts of God we have to the intended meaning of the word God, which the author has. So much like Plato, Socrates, Euthyphro, when Descartes uses the word God, he means something slightly different than when Leibniz uses the word God. And they both mean something quite different than when Hegel uses the word God. And so it's important that we'll just use the word, or read the word God, to know what the concept the author had in mind is. So the first question that Solomon and Higgins present is what are the most prominent features of God? This question is just as important if you are an agnostic or an atheist. It is important to know what it is you don't believe in or don't know. Perhaps you don't believe in a fatherly God who looks after us, but do believe in some vital force or prime mover that got the universe going in the first place, for example, right? So they're describing perhaps an Aristotelian notion of God, which would be more deistic, or Voltaire's notion of God, as opposed to a different notion of God that would be more theistic as opposed to deistic. So the first exercise we'll have is just when we think of varieties of concepts of God, utilizing philosophical vocabulary to describe this God. accurately. And so some of the characteristics of God in various traditions are as follows. So when we're thinking of the most prominent features of God's, perhaps we ask, what are the most prominent features of God in which this God would not be God according to the concept? Is the God all-powerful, all-knowing? Did the God create the universe? Or perhaps was the universe already there with God? Or was the universe there first and then there was God? Right, so there's all these fascinating different ideas, and all are represented in the various philosophical and religious traditions. There's a variety of gods, both in a paradigm in which there are many gods, and there's a variety of gods in the idea that there's just one God, but there's a variety of different concepts on what this God is. Does God care about human beings? Does God have emotions? If so, which one? Love, jealousy, anger, wrath, vengeance, mercy, and others. Here with the emotions and with the idea of change in general, we might also ask, is God perfect? Some traditions, some ideas says, yes, God is perfect. But then we ask a further question, such as, what does perfection mean? Does perfection mean that the nature of God changes? Or that the nature of God is so perfect that the nature of God does not have to change? If the nature of God is so perfect that the nature of God does not have to change, then how can God have emotions is another philosophical question one might ask, right? And so if the God is perhaps happy and then the God becomes angry, does that count as change? If that counts as change, how do we understand change with perfection? So there's quite a bit of other philosophical questions that arise given once we start to create attributes in the concept of God. How do we understand this, right? So if we go back for a second, I'll give another example, but this is the type of thing to begin to think about when you're thinking about concepts of God. Is God all-powerful? Let's say a person says, yes, God is all-powerful. Then we might ask, well, does that mean that human beings have no power? And if we have no power, does that mean we don't have free will? Same thing if God is all-knowing and knows that everything is going to happen, then how do we understand free will? And so these begin to be the types of philosophical questions that philosophers will ask and later write answers to that we'll be reading and pondering about. But so this question kind of opens us up to this type of philosophical thinking about our concepts of God. Is God distinct and separate from the world? Is God knowable to us? And if so, to what extent? Some might, in a certain way, maybe metaphorically, we can understand God, but can we understand God as God is? Can God take or has ever taken human form? So all of these questions and some of the other ones I added are questions we ask perhaps on the different concepts of God that we have. And when we're reading philosophical literature about the nature of God, we kind of ask, what does the author think about these types of things? Think of this question 2, as sort of a checklist. When you read the word God in philosophical literature, how is the author answering these types of questions? How the author answers these types of questions will give you a better understanding about their concept of God so that you can have their concept of God accurately in your mind as you read their text. And again, this has nothing to do with one's own personal belief. It's just sort of accurately understanding what the author means. Another question, these are the closing questions. In this text, there's opening questions at the beginning of the text and closing questions at the end. Give a general description of God, noting those characteristics without which you would not be willing to use the word God. If you don't believe in God, say with some precision what it is that you don't believe. Again, it's not necessarily about belief or disbelief, it's more about concept formation. But yeah, so what about this concept makes it God? What are these attributes? So this closing question 1 is very similar to opening question 2 in this sense. Now closing question 2 has to do with theodicy. A theodicy is a justification for an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God, given the problem of evil. And in week 3 and week 4, we'll be looking much more closely at theodicy and anti-theodicy. Anti-theodicy isn't against or disproving theodicy. It simply doesn't utilize theodicy to acknowledge the concept of God. A good example might be the book of Job, which we'll also go over in week 3. So question 2 says, if you believe that there is a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and concerned with justice and the well-being of humanity, explain how there can be so much evil and suffering in the world. And then it elaborates on that. And so this is quite fascinating. So many philosophers of religion will sort of take up this idea. If we suppose, and there are many concepts of God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and sometimes omnibenevolent or perfectly good, and this argument kind of goes, if God was all-powerful, God would know evil was going to happen. If God was, all-knowing, God would know evil was going to happen. If God was all-powerful, then God would stop evil. And if God was perfectly good, then God would not want evil to happen. And yet evil happens. Explain why. And this is sort of the job of the philosopher, to try to sort this out. Given a concept of God and given a phenomenon of evil, how do we make it make sense? And there's many different theodicies. We'll explore those in week 3. But this question is more geared at this point to get us thinking about how concepts of God interact with human experience. A very powerful human experience is the experience of evil, or mortality, needless suffering, gratuitous suffering, and suffering on large scales. We distinguish between moral evil, which is evil that human beings do to each other, and natural evil, such as unfortunate events, earthquake, tornadoes, hurricanes, things like these that cause a lot of destruction. How do these phenomena interact with concepts of God? So this is another very fascinating philosophical question to be aware of. And then closing question 4, which is also quite nice. Choose one of the traditional proofs of God's existence and work out in some detail, answering objections and making the argument as irrefutable as you can. We will get to proofs, or traditional proofs for the existence of God in week 2, in our next presentation. And there are 4 that we'll be looking at. There is the argument of design. There is the cosmological argument. There's the ontological argument, and there is Pascal's wager. And we'll be looking at each of these in detail. We'll get to this in the next lecture. But this is sort of looking at how philosophers use different forms of reasoning to try to argue for the existence of God, and then how other philosophers take issue with some of the steps and try to argue against the argument. So in the next lecture, we'll be arguing both. We won't ourselves be arguing, but we'll be utilizing this question and exploring it for the idea on can we establish the existence of God based on a form of reasoning, and then we'll look at counter arguments to each of those arguments. So this will be in week 2 next week. Now we're going to be looking at some vocabulary. So some vocabulary to be utilizing in relation to God. Let's look at the first 2, theism and deism. These definitions are taken again from the Big Question text, chapter 3, and also the glossary. So the belief in God. So this theist is a person who believes in God, but when contrasted with deism, which is the belief that God, the belief in a God, that the God created the universe, but then plays no further role. And so this God created the universe, but then takes no interest in it, doesn't interact with it. If a person would not pray to a God like this, because this God, again, would not be paying attention. In contrast with deism, theism suggests that this God is involved in the universe in some way, either is interacting with human beings or creation, takes interest in human behavior, wants a certain goal for human beings. So if a person believes in this type of God, their belief would be viewed as more theistic. I would say arguably all the world's religions believe in some form of theism as opposed to deism, but there is some exception. Whereas deism believes more that God created the universe, but then plays no further role. Voltaire had a concept of God like this. Is often to answer the philosophical question, why is there something as opposed to nothing? Or how did the universe come into being? People presuppose a deistic form of God, but then they don't necessarily posit this God interacting anymore. Whereas if you did, for example, that would be more of a theistic as opposed to deistic belief. Monotheism is the belief in one God, and so and polytheism is the belief in many gods. And so this is sort of distinguishing one's concept of gods or the gods. And so Euthyphro, in Plato's Euthyphro, has much more of a belief in polytheism when he'll cite Zeus interacting with Kronos. And then Socrates asks him, how do we know, how can we say that the gods want something when all the gods want different things? And so this would be an example of a concept of the gods that would have to be understood in relation to other gods, whereas monotheism posits the existence of one God. Atheism is the belief that God does not exist. And here we're sort of looking in the paradigm of the Abrahamic religions generally. Other religious traditions are understood as atheistic in a Dharmic paradigm, but they do believe in the existence of gods in a general sense, but in the larger karmic paradigm. So here the term atheism can have a variety of meanings, but in this particular definition, it might be best understood in contrast to the belief that the monotheistic type of understanding does not exist, or they do not believe in it. But again, this is somewhat complicated, and we'll discuss this more as the weeks continue. Agnosticism is the uncertainty about the existence of God. This individual will say there's just not enough information to make an informed decision whether God exists or does not exist. Whereas the atheist will say, no, there is enough information to correctly posit that God does not exist, and the theist will say there is enough information to believe that God does exist. The agnostic suspends judgment. Other vocabulary involving concepts of God are anthropomorphic. Anthropos from the Greek word for human, and morphic in shape. This is in relation to God. All these are in relation to God, even though they can be in relation to other things in language, means that the God has human characteristics. And so when you would be describing this God, it would take on some type of human form or human attributes, whereas the theriomorphic would take on animal characteristics or attributes. And so it can be physical, or it can be more characteristic in behavior or emotions or something like that. Transcendent means beyond the ordinary world of human experience. This is often, if you sort of draw it graphically, you draw a circle in which you label the universe or creation, and then God is outside of that circle, right? God can interact, but that interaction is known as sort of a transcendent movement. So there is all of creation, and then there is God apart from, separate from, perhaps interacting, depending if it's theistic or deistic. But there is a distinction between God and creation, whereas eminent is the very opposite of that. God is not outside of us or distinct from the universe. Pantheism, pan meaning all, theism meaning God, is the belief that God is identical with creation. This is quite fascinating. We'll get into this in more detail in later presentations and reading, but there isn't a distinction between God and creation, and this is also an eminent view. And panentheism, which is similar, except there's that in, right? Which means that God is in every part of the world, all. God is in every part of the world, but yet is distinct from it and transcends it. And so it's sort of a combination of the transcendent, the eminent, aspects of the eminent, and the pantheism is panentheism. God is distinct from the world and in that way transcendent, but is also present in every part of creation. And so these are some of the definitions on various concepts of God, and some of the questions that we initially asked to sort of provoke questions about the concepts of God we already have existing in our mind, and how we can utilize this vocabulary to enrich those concepts and to also articulate our understandings of different authors' concepts of gods that we'll be reading. The next lecture will be on rational arguments for the concept of God. And these arguments are cosmological argument, meaning that argument from existence, or argument explaining existence, from the Greek word cosmos, argument from design, which is an argument from analogy, the ontological argument, which I think is probably the most fascinating, argument from being. From the concept of God, you can derive that God exists, and then Pascal's wager. Now, for each of these arguments in the next lecture, we'll be going over first a definition of them, then a traditional argument for it, and then some objections for each one. And so I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions on it, feel free to email me via Canvas. And yeah, go ahead and do the reading for chapter 3, and review both the definitions as well as ponder the questions. Thank you.